Okay. Um, so luckily for everyone who's not here, these are recorded. If you're watching tomorrow or some next day, thanks for tuning in. Feel free to have this on as a podcast in the background if you're doing something else. But we have a lot of good pictures and visuals in this presentation today. So let me go ahead and get this shared up on the screen here. And
Thanks for doing this. I'm excited. It'll be great.
yeah, thanks for being here. Yeah, we haven't had a ton of people tune in live, unfortunately, but I think I have had a lot of people tell me that they've been watching them later. So I'm just glad that the word is getting out there and people are getting to tune in at some point that works for them. Okay, so I named this presentation Strong as Smooth because I didn't want to do all of this talking about ideal running form and things that we see in the clinic in terms of gait analysis that is quote unquote wrong with people's running form without teaching people at least a few strategies for how to fix it or to make it better, right? So talking about some kind of strength aspects of running that can help us with our running form with what we see from a gait analysis perspective and all that good stuff. So here's our little course map. We're going to go over some running form basics so we know what normal running gait looks like before we start to talk about what could go wrong or the things that we typically see in both healthy and injured runners. So again, a lot of this, and I'll say this so many times tonight, that there's no perfect running form. We do kind of measure some ideals, and there's some key things that we are looking for in terms of, hey, this might cause an injury down the road or could put you at risk for injury. But there is only one kind of optimal running form for you as an athlete, and that's where the individual pieces come in. And like I said, we'll talk about some interventions to correct some of the gait deviations that we're going to talk about today. Okay, so again, there is no perfect running form. The variation between individuals is normal. There's only one ideal running form for you specifically. And, if we talk about running or walking gait, a lot of these things go back to when we were, growing up as babies, as toddlers, as children, and learning how to move and interact with the world. And when we grew through puberty and stuff like that, the way we moved changed again. So again, there's no perfect running form, and everyone kind of comes about how they move or how they run in their own special way, which is why it's really important not to get too hung up on being perfect or looking like some of the examples that I'm going to show a little bit later. But we do know that how we run greatly influences the stress on our bodies. So a story I like to use to demonstrate this fact is that during COVID, I was part of the Atlanta Triathlon Club at the time, and they were hosting a I forget what it was called now, but it was a 5K that was, I think, Support ATL 5K it was called, and all the proceeds went to struggling businesses during COVID, so things like restaurants, things like that. And I wanted to participate, definitely wanted to donate, but I didn't feel like time trialing a 5K by myself. And I didn't feel like running 5K and just calling it a virtual 5K. But I saw on the website that there was a costume division. So I was like, okay, I'm going to enter the costume division. So I go to the place where all great ideas are formed, Amazon.com. And I start just randomly looking at different costumes and thinking what would be the funniest for me to run this 5K. And of course, not taking into account that this was like in the middle of June, right? And so, of course, I ran on the classic inflatable T-Rex costume, with the floppy head and everything. And, me being someone who enjoys things like this has been wanting to have this in my repertoire for a while. So like, great, this is a great investment in my future to buy this T-Rex costume. So I do this 5K and long story short, do the 5K in the T-Rex costume. And I wake up the next morning and I am so incredibly sore. Like my hamstrings, my medial hamstrings, my adductors, like, cause you waddle basically inside this costume. I also am not like I'm a small human, so I kind of had to hold the costume up a little bit. So my shoulders were sore because I couldn't move my arms, all these things. So just goes to show that the running differently does change the stress on your body. And so that's why it's important to consider running form when we're talking about trying to prevent injury. And so transitioning from the T-Rex story, we can evaluate muscular weaknesses and neuromuscular control, or in other words, how we control our body through gait analysis. And this is something I do in the clinic all the time, whether we're trying to optimize someone's efficiency and help them get faster, or we're trying to figure out why did they get injured in their last training cycle, for example, or why did they have this one issue pop up at mile 16 of the marathon, for example, because our running form is going to change with fatigue and with duration of a run. So no matter how skilled we are, if we start to fatigue, some of those biomechanics are going to break down. And the more resilient we can be to those changes, the better off we are to push ourselves without hurting ourselves, right? Okay, so this is a little bit confusing. I actually only want you guys to pay attention to the left side of the screen here, because this is usually the side that I will reference when I'm talking about running form. And so that's because this is our stance phase. So on this side, we're referencing kind of this closest. It's kind of hard to tell because the figure is black, but so I like to divide running form up into two different phases. So we have the energy absorption phase and the energy production phase. And so that transition comes right here in the half, or roughly the half of this figure here. But I like to break up running gait to make it really simple. We're referencing one leg at a time in stance phase. So initial contact, so when the foot first hits the ground, mid stance, which is that middle part of running form. It's not necessarily shown very well here, but that's when the knee of our stance leg, so the leg that's on, or the foot that is on the ground, and the swing leg, so the other leg, those knees are in the same plane because they're starting to pass each other as we take our next step. And then toe off, so that's when we're pushing off the ground. And so don't get me wrong, things can happen in swing phase too, but the stance phase is when we are on the ground. That's when our muscles are having to absorb the force, and this is where most injuries occur. And so that's why we spend a lot of time, especially in the rehab and physical therapy world, talking about stance phase and mid stance in particular. So let's talk about some really good running form here. If you guys are running fans, this is Emily Sisson. No, Emily Sisson is not perfect. I swear, I feel like I could. She's been talking on podcasts about she gets this side stitch on the same side, and it's affected her in her past few races, and I swear I could fix it. Like armchair PT over here. But anyway, she has very, very good running form, so I think she's a great example. So here on the left, we're looking at basically initial contact starting to move into mid stance here. And so what we see, the positives that we see here is that her foot is landing pretty close underneath her body. And so we'll get into this for a little bit later, but I really don't care where on the foot people land in terms of heel, midfoot, or forefoot, but more so, where is that foot landing in relation to the rest of the body? Because the further out in front it is, the more energy we have to overcome to get over that foot. And it also usually creates a pretty stiff limb. So our knee can tend to be very straight there. And that can cause a lot more joint reaction force and force going through the joint that we could avoid if we were to just hit closer to our body. So that's what we're seeing here. Foot is underneath the body, slight bend in the knee. Her posture is really good, so she's got a slight forward lean. So that tells me that once she gets that foot underneath her and she starts to push, she's going to get a lot of forward motion. And that's what we really see here on the right, is that her foot is not even completely left the ground. You can just see how much power and forward movement she's getting here. There's no wasted movement. And of course, there's only so much we can see in a still frame like this. But I think these are two good examples of things that I'm looking for sort of in snapshot form, at least from the side. And I think this kind of encompasses a lot of what we look at. The other thing is the arm swing. And so Emily's got a little bit of a lower arm carriage, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. And we can see that she actually doesn't move her arms a ton, which makes sense, right? Because Emily is she did run the 10K in the Olympics last 4 years ago. But She's primarily a marathoner now, so you wouldn't expect her to have a huge arm swing. I think she's doing like a tempo workout here, so she's running about marathon pace. But she does have a little bit of a less of an arm swing than what we would maybe typically cue in the clinic for people. But by and large, really, really good running form. So some of these definitions we'll use, some of them we won't. But I just want to have them here just in case I say some word that's not familiar to you guys. So cadence is a big topic. We'll elaborate on this here, I think, in the next slide. But this is strides per minute. So this is each foot strike. So this is a lot of time the info that you're getting from your Garmin watch, and is a measure that is pretty accurate on watches these days. And then stride length is the distance between a stance leg and the swing leg. So that's between when your right foot hits the ground, the distance between when your right foot hits the ground and then your left foot hits the ground next. Like that would be the stride length. Also a measure that is in most watches these days. Vertical oscillation is how much the body moves up and down. And so this can be a measure of efficiency because that means, like I was talking with Emily back here, she has very minimal vertical oscillation because all of her energy is going forward. But sometimes we can see that people get a lot more vertical movement than forward movement. And so not only can this increase the force with which we hit the ground because we're effectively falling from further, but it also hinders some of our efficiency and we lose more going up. This is also a measure that's in your watch or in Garmin. It's often kind of called vertical ratio. And then some watches are able to measure the actual amount of vertical oscillation, or at least estimate it. Ground reaction force is something I'm going to reference kind of throughout, but that's the force that is returned to the body with each step. So if you remember from like physics class or something like that, there's an equal and opposite force anytime two objects contact each other. So that object would be you on the ground, right? So the ground, we exert a force into the ground exerts a force back to us. Ankle dorsiflexion, hip extension. So these are two measures of joint angles. Ankle dorsiflexion being the angle between the shin bone and the foot. So that's a measure of ankle mobility. And then hip extension, how far the thigh is able to travel behind the body. And so this is something we're looking at often to tell how well runners are using their glutes, for example, which is a very common question people have, like, how do I use my glutes more with running? And we are going to talk a little bit about that as well. Okay, so cadence first. So there is no magic number. So a lot of people are familiar with the 180 or the number 180 because there has been a few studies that were done on elite marathoners actually running at race pace, which already is not most of us when we're out running, right? But there is no magic number, and it can depend on a lot of things. So again, this is very individualized. Granted, I usually don't want to see people too much below like 170 or so, but this again really depends on the person. And but cadence can be a measure that not only can help increase speed for a lot of people, but minimize forces in the body, and we're going to talk about that in a second. But if you're a really tall person, if you have really long legs, 180 is probably not going to be in the cards just because it just takes so long to turn your legs over. And so that doesn't necessarily increase your injury risk. It just that's just how your body is built. But we do know that a lower cadence means longer time on the ground. So of course, relatively, because we're really not on the ground that much. But if we are taking less steps, that foot is on the ground longer. There's more time for the force to come through our body. And that's why I think we've seen these studies that have shown that increased cadence increases our glute med activation and can decrease knee pain just because we are on the ground for a less amount of time and those muscles get contracting a little bit faster. But cadence is something we'll manipulate quite often. And so we're going to talk about this in what scenarios I might do that as we keep moving through the presentation here. But the most important takeaway is there's no magic number. It depends on you. And I won't always change people's cadence if I don't feel like it's going to change the aspect of running form that I see as a potential problem. Okay, so here's the fun part. We're going to talk about some common gait deviations, I'm calling them. So just little abnormal things that are away from those ideals that I was just talking about earlier. And may in italics here, they may lead to injury, right? So we've seen so many people, maybe professionals or in bigger stages that have atrocious running form and they're completely fine, right? So there's high correlation, but not necessarily always causation, right? Okay, the dreaded hip drop. So this is one that a lot of people seem to be familiar with. When I say the word hip drop in clinic, people kind of cower, is almost like I called them a bad name or something like that. So what this is it is a drop of the hip. So in this runner here, we are seeing a drop of the right hip, which is related to weakness of the left hip. And so on the left side, so for this runner, this means that the left gluteus medius, so one of our glute muscles, is not doing its job of keeping our pelvis level. So its job is the gluteus medius, or glute med as we call it, its job is to keep our pelvis level. So this two sides of our pelvis, right, in single leg stance. And so if it's not doing its job, we're going to see that drop here. And so this is a pretty easy fix for the most part in terms of doing some hip and core strengthening. So minimizing how much movement through the pelvis and through the abdominal region that we get, which is going to help stabilize us when we're in single leg stance. So how I might do that is by some specific strengthening here. So I have two exercises that I really like to give for this. And of course, they're not the only exercises. They're not quote unquote the best exercises, but they're ones I find that are very specific to hip drop, right? Okay, so we call this a heel tap, or it's basically a single leg squat, right? And so here's my former coworker, Ryan, and you can see that he's really pushing his hips back so that his knee stays behind his toes. And then what we can see a little bit better here from the front, he's going to maintain his pelvis as level as he can as he does this motion here. And then we're going to practice this knee tracking here by not letting that knee dive inward, which is another consequence or something that usually comes together with hip drop. So we'll watch this through one more time. So this is a short step because the depth of the step isn't as important. This is basically practicing almost the exact amount of range of motion we need to be able to control with running. The other important thing is to really, really sit back, because that is what's going to move the work of this exercise from the quad and the thigh into the glute. If you can do this one in front of a mirror so that you can kind of keep tabs on all of these things, that would be ideal. This one's easy to do at home, especially if you have stairs in your home. Of course, stairs are going to be a slightly higher than this step that is in this example, but definitely a great stand-in. Okay, and then another one. So this one is me. This is a standing clamshell, much, much better than a sideline clamshell. If you want me to get into that rant, I will. So band is around the knees. I'm going to prop my back leg up. And so really this exercise is for my right leg in this example, because I am having to control that resistance of the rotation from my moving leg. And again, I'm in that same sort of mid-stance posture that we were observing in the previous slide. So here, because I have both of my knees in the same plane, roughly about a shin bone's length away from the wall. And then I'm just trying to stay as steady through my body and my foot on that right side as I can here. Also a really great warm-up exercise to help get the glutes kind of firing, warmed up, doing their thing, so that we can maximize function, minimize too much movement while we're out running. Okay, overstriding. So this one isn't too bad, this example anyway. I've definitely seen a little bit more exaggerated, but I really chose for this presentation some more subtle examples because it really doesn't take much sometimes. So overstriding is what I was talking about earlier in terms of initial contact happening too far in front of the body. And so what we can see in this runner here is that it results in a straighter knee here. Again, hers is not too terrible, but sometimes I will see much of a stiffer knee at this initial contact. And then we'll see a greater, what we call inclination angle, which is the angle between the treadmill or the ground and the shoe. And so this makes the front of the muscles work really hard. So sometimes can cause like shin splints, things like that. And then, yes, the most common issue or area of discomfort I will see with this particular pattern is knee pain. It usually happens just because of habit. So sometimes we're just used to this pattern, or we've been told that longer strides are better. And so we have these long strides, and it can result in hitting a little bit too far in front, or a lower cadence. So in this instance, sometimes I will use a cadence cue of some sort, which I forgot to mention in the previous slide, but there's a lot of apps nowadays that are metronome apps. Sometimes they're actually meant for musicians, but they can produce a beep or a sound at different cadences. So when you know what you want to target from a cadence perspective, you can set it to that. And a lot of them allow you to play the beeping in addition to music, or a lot of people know that there are playlists now, like on Spotify, that have different strides per minute that can help cue you as well. So that's how we would cue cadence if we wanted to do that. And then there's a few different drills that we could use as well, which we're going to look at a few here in a second. And then there's a couple of different just verbal cues I'll give people. So this is one time where I might cue someone to hit somewhere differently on their foot. So I might say, try to land with your foot more flat, or more on your midfoot, because that automatically gets people to bring that foot underneath them. Another one I'll use is trying to land softer, which this will just cause people to kind of, they'll bend their knee a little bit more at initial contact. And so that can help get that foot closer as well. And it's a really handy cue, especially if you run on the treadmill at all, because the treadmill is really loud and unforgiving when it comes to noise. So you could use just the sound of the treadmill to help correct for that as well. Okay, so this is an example of an A-skip, which is if you've done anything like track or yeah, probably just track, I would say. You might be familiar with the A-skip. But what he's just saying is he's working on a little bit of a skip and getting that leg underneath him before starting to hop forward. And so I like this one, again, as a pre-run warm-up to get used to that. But this can be a little bit of an exaggerated version of getting that foot underneath us a little bit closer. And you can also see he's got his arms involved as well. And we can actually work on landing softer here as well. So that's one way we could do it from a drill perspective. Okay, so this is a big one. Upright posture or backwards lean. This is actually one of my personal gait deviations that I have worked really, really hard on. Some days I nail it, other days I don't, especially when I'm tired. But this is another reason why actually someone might overstride as well, because if we're leaning back, then the front of our body is going to compensate, and so we'll land a little bit more in front. And so again, this particular runner isn't doing anything too crazy, but you can definitely see that when that foot hits the ground, his shoulders are sort of behind his hips because he's leaning back into the back seat, if you will. And so this can happen, again, because of habit, core weakness, or overstriding. So if we do tend to take those longer strides, we, again, will counterbalance by leaning back. And then I think a lot of it is just fatigue. I think we see this a lot more in, if you watched any of the track and field trials, you'll see a lot of the athletes, especially in that last 100 meters, starting to like really get upright, which is kind of funny because it's the opposite of what we want to do, right? We want to get everything as far forward as we possibly can. But again, this can cause things like low back pain, hip pain, because we're not able to use our glutes in this position, because when we're leaned back, we're going to have more lumbar extension. So you can see in this particular runner that his low back is extended. And so this can cause that kind of like a compression of the low back. And then also just puts our pelvis in a really difficult position in order to be able to use our glutes. So how we would fix this is just working on the cueing of forward lean, and working on the core strength to be able to hold the body there. And then also, again, we could play with cadence and see if that improves this at all. But when I think about posture, which we're gonna actually, let's go ahead and go to the next slide because this will make a little more sense. So this is sort of a drill / core exercise that we at the clinic love to give out to people who have problems with this. The reason being is that it practices what we call a stacked posture, right? So one cylinder is my rib cage, the other cylinder is my pelvis, and we want them to stay stacked on each other as we lean forward. So when we're talking about forward lean, it's more leaning from the ankles and leaning the whole body forward, not just sticking out the chest, because that's obviously going to accentuate the problem. And it's not kind of slouching or bending at the waist or the shoulders. So this is my coworker Elizabeth here, my wonderful coworker Elizabeth. And so what she's doing, she's practicing having her pelvis and her rib cage stacked on one another as she's leaning forward, using the ball for as little support as possible. So her grip on the ball is very, very light, trying not to put any weight through the ball as she leans forward from this, in this case, from the knees. And starting in this position from the knees versus from the feet or the ankles is easier. It takes one more joint out of it, right? And so there's so many different ways we could play with this and use this as sort of practice. But what I like to do is just kind of teach people what that feels like to be stacked in the rib cage and leaned forward, so that they can remember that when they run, be like, okay, is this correct? And is my posture the way it needs to be? And so to actually feel it in a little bit of a safer environment can help with that. And then I like to use this actually as endurance too, so we can get into that forward lean position and hold it for a defined amount of time and focus on breathing. And there's just a lot of different things we can do with this. But I think this provides a good visual of how we want our pelvis and rib cage to be stacked when we are in a forward lean position. And as we saw with Emily in the pictures previously, she had a pretty good forward lean with her rib cage tucked, not tucked, but her rib cage is not flared up to where she can't use her glute muscles.
Hey, Kacy, super quick question.
Yeah, sure.
Like practice with the lean forward, is that something that could be done well with TRX straps? I'm trying to think of how to implement that, and I feel like that could maybe like hold
Yeah,
it.
actually, yeah, TRX would be great because it would give you some support, and you could do either in kneeling or in a standing position, just depending on how your TRX is set up. We give people like a standing drill too that's kind of similar to this. Some people, I have a patient who calls it the doing the Michael Jackson, where you kind of
Nice.
lean at the ankles and try to like lean forward and keep everything stacked without losing your balance, for example. But I think TRX would be a great way to practice this in a standing position. And then also, yeah, if you've got them available, I think that'd be a really good place to start.
Awesome. That's super helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Okay, so pronation control. Again, one of those big bad words in running. People think it's pronation is bad. And pronation is actually part of running and walking gait. If we don't pronate or if we underpronate, that can be a problem too. So it's not all bad. It definitely has to happen within running gait or walking gait. But the key is we want to be able to control it. We want it to happen at the correct phase of gait, which is mid stance in this case, or in the case of running gait. And we don't want it to happen too quickly, which kind of goes hand in hand with controlling it. This particular runner here is the first person I've ever recommended specifically to use a stability shoe, because I most often there's something else that we can address from a strength perspective, or a mobility perspective that can help with this. And I'd rather not put someone in a super controlling shoe, which this could be its own talk, and I have given an entire talk on pronation before. But the running shoe industry has moved very middle ground. Even with some of their more stable shoes, they're not quite as stable as like the stability category of old. So that's a little bit of an aside. But anyway, the reason why I recommended it for this particular runner is he had a lot of hypermobility in his foot. And so I knew we had to work on strength and a lot of the control things that I would work with a normal with other athletes. But I felt like he was just too mobile and that we would never really get enough strength there for him to be able to truly control his pronation and minimize his risk for injury, especially considering the specific issue that he was coming in for, which was repetitive tibial stress fractures. So anyway, a little bit of an anecdote there. But that's why this is so exaggerated, just because he had so much mobility in his foot. So again, pronation is early or excessive or overpronation. This is not what pronation in general is, but overpronation would be early or excessive inward collapsing of the foot and ankle. So it's a combined movement of everything moving inward. It can happen because of weakness of the posterior tibialis muscle, which is kind of what I like to call our natural orthotic, or it's what supports our midfoot from a muscular perspective. Then we have our foot intrinsics, which are the muscles that are just unique to the foot itself, and those play a role in maintaining the arch and controlling midfoot movement. If we have weakness of the hips, similar to what we saw with hip drop, so if that hip drops, femur is going to rotate inward, tibia is going to rotate inward, foot has to follow. So sometimes weakness of the hips can actually lead to pronation issues as well. Again, one of the reasons why it's good to have someone who is skilled in looking at this, figure out exactly where this might be coming from for you individually. And then, yeah, foot structure. So some people have lower arch heights, and so we're going to see a different pronation pattern for them. And then in this particular case, there could be some hypermobility through the midfoot that could be causing some of what we're observing here as well. So all of this to say, we can play with different inserts, orthotics, shoe changes, things like that. But no matter what we do from a shoe or equipment perspective, we still need to work on strength. So that's what I like to focus on as a PT, because I like to really allow our body to do what it's meant to do, which is support ourselves when we're running. So this is my favorite exercise for this. And I like it because it is fairly easy to set up. And I think it really works the posterior tibialis and peroneal muscles in tandem. And then also in a very functional position of standing. So this isn't, your non-weight bearing, just move your foot in and out. This one works in a very specific way. And something you might have noticed with all of these exercises and interventions I provided is all of them are done in a standing position because that is most functional to running. Of course, we have to have our foundational strength to be able to get here. But at some point in everyone's program, we want to get them doing functional position strengthening. So I have a band around an object that is heavy enough that isn't going to move. And so it is pulling me laterally. And so I like to start with just some taps and then work into a little bit more of a lunge pattern. And so you can see that the band right now is trying to pull me to the outside part of my foot, or supination, if you will. So then you'll turn around and do other direction. And so this time, this is usually more challenging for people because this is pulling me into pronation. So this is the most specific way for me to practice. We'll run this through again. For me to practice controlling pronation in a standing position. I've got a green band, which is like a moderate resistance here. Really any band will do, because the further you step away from your attachment point, the more resistance you're going to have. And so you have some versatility here. So again, this direction with the band pulling me inward towards my arch is probably going to be our most specific. And then I like the lunge pattern because it makes me also control my hip and knee at the same time. And then another option for us, also pretty simple, is the kettlebell pass around, or an object pass around, as I like to say. So any object between like 5 and 10 pounds will work here. And so what I'm doing is I'm trying to keep my foot as stable as I possibly can, really pushing through my big toe and lifting my arch as I'm doing this. I really should have retaken this video because I didn't do a great job here. A little bit of wobbly postural sway, but and then a way to progress it would be to bring my knee up. So I'm actually having to lift the kettlebell up, and it just requires a little bit more balance. Gives me a little bit more challenge there. But the nifty thing about this exercise too is that the foot posture that I'm trying to maintain here with my big toe engaged, my arch lifted, can apply to any exercise you're doing in a single leg position. So single leg deadlift, single leg squat, lunge. It's really important to think about where is my weight distributed, because we want to be evenly distributed throughout the entire foot. And then also, is my my big toe grounded and arch in kind of a neutral position. And so effectively, we can practice this with really any single leg exercise. Okay, getting into the home stretch here. So crossbody arm swing. So this is when, let's sit up a little bit. So when what we want is the arm swing to be in this plane. So moving at our sides, elbow going directly behind us, hand swinging directly in front of us. What we'll see a lot of is either arms here and crossing this way, or somehow going across the body. And so the reason why this is important is because what happens in our upper body reciprocally happens in our lower body, right? So if we think about running as, opposite arm, opposite leg forward, and then switch, right? So our arm is going to influence our legs. Arms are going to influence our legs. And so this is a simple fix for some people who have like a hip drop pattern, or even a crossover gait pattern. So if we're crossing over here, we also might cross over in the lower legs, which can cause some problems too. And that's a gait deviation I didn't include in this presentation, but it's also a common one we see. So this can happen again just because of habit. This is how we learned how to run when we were kids, and no one taught us what to do with our arms. I saw a very cute example of this. I guess it was several months ago now. I was doing a gait analysis on a woman who was in her 70s maybe, and she was like, "Oh, I'm so glad you taught me that. No one ever told me what to do with my arms." And because she had some crazy arm action going on, and once she picked it up, I mean, it fixed everything. Everything looked much, much better. And she was so happy someone had finally taught her how to do what to do with her arms. So anyway, this can happen just because of habit. Tightness of the thoracic spine, which is our upper back. So in this particular runner, it'd be kind of this region where the sports bra lays. Pec tightness. So if we're tight here, because all of us are on our phones or our computers, we can get really tight here, and then we kind of can't get here, right? So then we just kind of keep arms this way. So in addition to just kind of being cognizant of it and working on it from a form perspective, stretching out the front of the shoulders or the pecs can help, or working on some of the thoracic spine, whether it be into extension or into doing different rotational patterns. And I'll show you an exercise you can do for that as well. And how do I fix it? Yep, so we went through all of that. Okay, so you can see this was taken in COVID times. Not sure why I was in my room by myself when I took this, but anyway. So I like this one because we can work on a little bit of hip mobility and hip extension here. So I'm stretching the front of my thigh in addition to working on some rotation through here. So you can see how this is sort of, again, very running specific, right? I've got one leg forward, one leg back, and I'm working on rotating over kind of my fixed leg, which is my right one in this case. So there's so many different exercises I could have put in here. I like this one because it captures a lot of different things, and I know runners don't like mobility or stretching. But this is a great bang for your buck one. One thing to note too is that I'm really trying to keep my hips stable. So I'm trying not to actually rotate through my hips too much. I'm trying to get as much movement through my my spine, and particularly my thoracic spine and my upper back as I'm doing this. And you can see my hip opens up a little bit. It's going to have to, but my focus is definitely trying to actually contract this right glute on this side so that I can rotate over it as much as I can through my thoracic spine. Okay, that's it. I will unshare this. So if y'all have any questions, you can go over them without, or I can bring the presentation back up. But any questions off of that? I know it was a lot, so I hope it wasn't too overwhelming.
No, that was so great. I do actually have one follow-up question. So you're kind of talking about cadence, and I understand there's no one perfect number, but you kind of mentioned that like not too far below 170. So I've been working on like really pretty easy runs, especially in the summer, and like kind of zone 2-ish adjacent to get more easy miles in. And
Sure.
I'm curious, like I think it's been a challenge to keep my cadence up in like easy runs. So is there kind of like a guidance of how to know if you're in a good range for yourself with that?
Yeah, so this is the challenging part, because when you are running slower, you can still you can still maintain a certain cadence going, like zone 2, like very, very easy. But there is a point where it becomes like kind of comical, right? If you're like doing this fast little cadence, not going anywhere. So I do think that there's a drop off for people where below a certain pace where the cadence is going to drop significantly. Like I know where mine is. Um, but so yeah, we would expect cadence to be a little lower in that case, but we wouldn't want to see like, I mean, gosh, yeah, like in the 160s or so, or like low 160s. I would be a little bit, I would put a little bit of effort into keeping it up like above 165 or so. But again, as long as like that foot is hitting underneath your body and you're not feeling like you're like really plodding, um, it's probably okay. But yeah, there is going to be like a shift in cadence when you're running slower versus faster.
That makes sense. That's a super helpful guideline. Thank you.
Yeah, I know it's a little bit gray, and this is a conversation I have with people all the time, and there isn't any exact number I can give people. A lot of it's visual for me, so like making sure that a lot of my other boxes are checked, be like, okay, this is probably not going to increase your injury risk, for example.
That definitely makes sense. Thanks, Kacy. I appreciate it. This was great.
Yeah, you're welcome. And it'll be recorded, so if you need to see the videos and stuff like that, you'll have those. And yeah, if you have any follow-up questions in the future, you can just shoot me an email at my position email.
Sweet. Thank you so much. Have a good night.
Yeah, thanks. You too. Thanks for being here.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.